I didn't feel sad when I found out. That surprised me. I thought I would. I thought when the moment came, when I finally saw it with my own eyes, I'd feel something collapse inside me. The way you feel when you drop something you can't replace. But I didn't. I just sat there in my kitchen at 11:30 at night, my reading glasses still on, a half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside me, staring at my phone. And what I felt was very quiet and very clear. I felt like a man who had just been handed the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. My son got married 3 weeks ago. I found out on a Tuesday. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what I did. My name is Theodore. Most people call me Theo. I'm 67 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house in Raleigh, North Carolina, that I bought with cash 22 years ago, back when this neighborhood was considered risky and nobody wanted in. My wife, Susan, picked it out. She said the bones were good. She was right about most things. She passed 11 years ago, breast cancer, and I have not moved since because the house still smells like her in certain rooms, depending on the season, and I am not ready to give that up. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer. Started with a firm in Charlotte, eventually started my own company with 2 partners, built it up, sold my share when I was 62, and retired comfortably. I'm not flashy about money. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150. I shop at Costco. I wear New Balance sneakers that I buy in bulk because I found a model I like and I don't trust that they'll still make it next year. My neighbors probably think I'm a retired school teacher. That's fine with me. Susan and I had 1 child, our son. His name is Caleb. Caleb is 33. He's smart, genuinely smart, the kind that comes easy to some people and makes them expect life to be easy too. He went to NC State on a partial scholarship. I covered the rest, about $28,000 over 4 years. After he graduated, I helped him get his first apartment, pay the deposit, and first 3 months because he'd just started a job in sales and was getting on his feet. That's what parents do. I didn't keep score. I didn't hand him a spreadsheet. He was my son and I loved him, and that was the whole of it. When Caleb was 29, he told me he wanted to start his own business, a marketing consultancy. He had a plan, a laptop full of slides, and a lot of confidence. What he didn't have was capital. He asked me for $40,000. I thought about it for a week. Susan would have said yes immediately. I took longer, not because I didn't want to help, but because I'd watched enough men give their children money and watch it change something between them. I decided to do it differently. I didn't give him the $40,000 as a gift. I drew up a simple agreement. Nothing cruel, just clear. The loan would be interest-free. He could take 5 years to repay it. There was no penalty if he needed more time. I just wanted him to understand that money has weight, that it comes from somewhere, that I worked for 31 years to accumulate what I have, and that one day he would inherit a significant portion of it, and I needed to know he understood what that meant before that day came. He signed. He thanked me. He hugged me and said, "Dad, I won't forget this." The business did well. Within 2 years he was pulling in decent contracts. He repaid about $18,000 of the loan before the payments stopped. I didn't chase him for it. I told myself he was reinvesting in the business. He was my son. I let it go. What I didn't notice, or maybe what I noticed and chose not to examine, was that somewhere in those 2 years, Caleb started changing. Small things at first. He stopped coming by on Sundays the way he used to. When we talked on the phone, he seemed distracted, always half somewhere else. When I mentioned Susan, he'd go quiet in a way that used to mean grief and started to mean inconvenience. Then he met Renee. I never had a problem with Renee. I want to be clear about that. She's a pretty woman, ambitious, comes from a wealthy family in Charlotte. Her father owns a chain of car dealerships across 3 states. I met her twice. Both times she was perfectly polite, the way someone is polite to a hotel receptionist. Not warm, not curious, just correct. Caleb was different around her. Straighter backed, better dressed. He started using phrases I didn't recognize as his. He started talking about building a legacy and moving in the right circles. He bought a BMW. He moved into a higher-priced apartment. He started referring to his business in ways that made it sound larger than I knew it to be. The last time I saw him in person was Thanksgiving, just the two of us, like always, since Susan died. He arrived an hour late, ate quickly, and spent most of the meal on his phone. When I asked about Renee, whether she'd be joining us next year, whether things were serious, he said, "We're figuring things out, Dad," in a tone that meant, "Don't ask again." I didn't ask again. I did what I always do when I don't know what else to do. I kept the house clean. I watched the game on Sunday. I called him every week, and sometimes he picked up and sometimes he didn't. That was the last 5 months. 11:30 on a Tuesday night. I'd been on the phone earlier with my friend Russell, who I've known since our kids were in Little League together. After we hung up, I was scrolling. I do that sometimes, just to feel like I'm not entirely disconnected from the world. And I ended up on Instagram because my neighbour's daughter had posted photos of her garden renovation that I'd said I'd look at. I don't follow Caleb on Instagram. He never offered, and I'm not the type to insert myself. But his profile came up in suggestions and I tapped it. I'm not sure why. Maybe something in me already knew. The first photo was from 8 days earlier. Caleb in a dark navy suit I'd never seen, standing in front of what looked like a rooftop venue in Charlotte. String lights, white flowers, a view of the skyline. His arm around a woman in a white dress, Renee. And around them, her parents, her 2 sisters, a group of people I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Married, my best friend surrounded by everyone who's always had my back." Couldn't have done any of this without my family. I read it 3 times. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. I didn't call him that night. I didn't call him the next morning either. I needed to think clearly, and I knew that if I called him before I was clear, I would say things I couldn't unsay, or worse, I'd accept an excuse I didn't believe, and then I'd spend the next 10 years pretending I had. So I thought for 2 full days. Here is what I know about my son. He is not a bad person. He has not been cruel to me deliberately, the way some people are cruel. What he has done is something quieter and in some ways worse. He has decided, gradually and without announcement, that I am not important, that I am background, that I am a resource, financial when needed, and an obligation, holidays, calls, but not a person he thinks of when life gets big. He stood in front of his wife and her entire family on what was supposed to be one of the most important days of his life, and I did not cross his mind. I want you to understand the weight of that. I'm not talking about hurt feelings. I'm not a man who sits around nursing hurt feelings. I'm talking about what that absence reveals. When you are planning a wedding, even a small one, even private, you think about who you want there. You make decisions. You choose. Caleb chose, and I was not the choice. But the caption, "Everyone who's always had my back," that's what I kept coming back to, because I have a specific memory of what having his back looked like. I remember a phone call at 2 in the morning from a county jail in Durham when he was 24. I remember driving through the dark without asking questions because the questions could wait. I remember a bail bondsman, $3,500, and a lawyer who charged $8,000 to make it go away. I remember telling him the next morning, calm as I could manage, "This is the last time I clean up something like this." And I meant it as love, as the kind of love that tells the truth. I remember the loan agreement, the $40,000, the $18,000 still outstanding. I remember paying his car insurance until he was 27 because he kept forgetting. I remember sitting with Susan the night before she died and she said, "Make sure Caleb knows he's loved." And I said, "He knows." And she said, "Tell him anyway." So I did. I told him often. I don't say any of this to score points. I say it because when you understand what I'd given, you'll understand what I did next. On Thursday morning, 2 days after I saw the photo, I called my attorney. His name is Philip, and he's been my attorney since I started the company. I trust him completely. I told him I needed to review 3 things. The first, the family trust. When I sold my share of the engineering firm, I restructured my estate into a revocable living trust. At that time, I had named Caleb as the primary beneficiary. Philip and I discussed modifying the beneficiary structure to include two charities I care about. One that builds affordable housing in rural North Carolina. One that funds engineering scholarships for first-generation college students. Caleb would remain a beneficiary but no longer the sole or primary one. The second, the promissory note. The $22,000 still outstanding on Caleb's business loan was legally owed. Philip confirmed what I already knew. It was collectible. I instructed him to send a formal notice of the outstanding balance, giving Caleb 60 days to repay or establish a payment schedule, not to punish him. Because the document existed and I had let it go too long out of softness, and softness wasn't doing either of us any good. The third was more personal. I own a piece of land, about 4 acres just outside Asheville, that I bought years ago with the vague idea of building a cabin someday. I'd mentioned it to Caleb once offhandedly and he lit up, said maybe he could build something there eventually. I'd never formalized that. It was just a comment. But I'd held it in the back of my mind as something I might leave him. I told Philip to record a conservation easement on the land, which would permanently restrict what could be built on it. The land would stay natural. If Caleb ever received it, he could not develop it. He could walk through it. He could sit by the stream that runs along the east edge, but he couldn't turn it into a profit. I'm aware some people will read that last part as petty. I've thought about it. I don't think it's petty. I think it's honest. I spent my life building things with purpose and care. I don't want my land to become a project for someone who's decided that value is only measured in what you can sell. Philip asked me once during that call if I was sure. He knows me well enough to ask without it being an insult. I told him yes. He said he'd have the paperwork ready by end of week. I didn't reach out to Caleb. I waited. He called me on a Saturday 11 days after the wedding photo, 9 days after I'd spoken to Philip. Hey, Dad. Hey. Pause. He was working up to something. I could tell by the way he breathed. So, I have some news. Renee and I, we actually got married. A few weeks ago. We kept it small, just close family. We're planning a bigger celebration later, and I want you to be part of that, obviously. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I said, I know, Caleb. I saw the photos. Another pause. Longer this time. I was going to call you sooner. It happened fast, and we wanted to keep it. Caleb. I kept my voice level. I'm not going to have this conversation on the phone. If you want to talk, come see me. He came that Sunday. Drove the 2.5 hours from Charlotte. He arrived looking composed in a way that told me he'd rehearsed. He had justifications ready. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done homework as a boy, where Susan used to serve pot roast on cold Sundays, and he explained carefully that he and Renee had wanted something private, that her family was close and had opinions about big weddings, that he'd intended to call me after, but things got busy. I listened to all of it, then I slid a copy of Philip's letter across the table, the one about the outstanding loan. His face changed. What is this? You know what it is. We had an agreement, $40,000, interest-free. You repaid $18,000 over 2 years, and then it stopped. This is formal notice that the remaining $22,000 is due within 60 days. Dad, I can't right now. There's a payment plan option outlined on the second page, as low as $500 a month. Philip structured it to be manageable. He stared at the letter. Then he looked up at me with an expression I recognized, the one that had always worked before, the one that said you're being unreasonable and you know it, and eventually you'll back down. I didn't back down. Is this because of the wedding? He asked. It's because we had a legal agreement that I honored and you stopped honoring. The wedding told me something about where I stand. The letter is about something else. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I thought you were okay. I thought we were fine. That one landed. I won't pretend it didn't. I thought we were too, I said, but you got married and didn't tell me, and your caption said you were surrounded by everyone who'd always had your back. I let that sit. I've been thinking about what that means since I read it. He didn't have an answer to that. We talked for another 2 hours. Some of it was hard. At one point his voice broke and I thought he might actually be reaching something real. He talked about feeling pressure from Renee's family, about not knowing how to integrate two worlds that seemed to pull in different directions, about feeling like he'd been making impossible choices for 2 years. I believed parts of it. I believed he'd been under pressure. I believed he'd made a choice that felt in the moment easier. But easier isn't innocent. And I told him so. Before he left, he asked me whether there was anything else I'd done, whether there were other legal things in motion that he should know about. I told him about the trust modification. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Mom would be upset with you for this." I thought about Susan, about what she would actually say. "Your mother would be upset with both of us," I said. "But she'd tell you that you can't ask someone to be proud of you while you're hiding from them." He left. He drove back to Charlotte. I stood at the front window and watched his BMW back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. And I felt the same thing I'd felt 11 days ago staring at that photo. Clear. Quiet. Sad in a way that wasn't grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, like standing in a room after someone's moved the furniture. Everything's still there, but the proportions are wrong. 3 weeks passed. Philip confirmed all 3 legal changes had been processed. I also, and I hadn't told Caleb this part yet, amended my beneficiary designations on 2 life insurance policies, not to remove him. I'm not trying to erase my son, but I shifted portions to a cousin of mine who works 2 jobs and has 3 kids and never asks for anything, and to Susan's sister, who's 71 and living on a fixed income in Phoenix, and who calls me every year on Susan's birthday just to say she remembers. I'm not doing this out of spite. I want to be honest with you about my motivations because I thought about them hard. What I'm doing is aligning my assets with what I actually value, and what I value is people who show up, people who don't forget you exist because they got busy, people who, when they found the love of their life and stood in front of it all and smiled for a camera, thought to include you. Caleb sent me an email 4 days after his visit. It was long, the longest he'd written me in years. He apologized. Not one of those compressed surface apologies that are really just requests for you to move on. A real one, or at least the closest thing to real I've seen from him in a while. He talked about being ashamed of the caption, said he hadn't even thought about how it would read to me, which I believe, and which is somehow worse than if he'd thought about it and done it anyway. He said he'd spoken to Renee and that she knew about our conversation. He said she felt bad. He said he wanted to bring her to meet me properly. A real dinner, not a glancing introduction. He didn't mention the loan. I wrote back. A short reply. I told him I appreciated the letter. I told him I'd be willing to meet Renee for dinner when he was ready to have a real conversation, not a performance. I told him the loan paperwork stood and that he should work with Philip on a schedule. And then I wrote one more thing. I told him I loved him, that I'd always loved him, that the love wasn't the question. The question was whether he wanted to have a real relationship with me, built on honesty and mutual respect, or whether he wanted to have a managed relationship, cordial, obligatory, transactional, and if so, I needed him to be honest about that so we could both stop pretending. I told him I didn't have unlimited time, not at 67, and I didn't want to spend what I had pretending that things were fine when they weren't. I told him the door was open, it had always been open, but he had to walk through it himself. That was 6 weeks ago. We've had 2 phone calls since. One was short and awkward, the other was almost an hour, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like we were actually talking, not performing or managing, but talking. He asked about his mother, something he hadn't done in years. I told him about the room that smells like her in autumn. I don't know if I cried. I think maybe I did, a little. He didn't comment on it. He sent the first loan payment last Tuesday, $500. I got the notification from my bank and I sat with it for a while. It's not about the money. I've said that and I mean it. It's about the weight of it. About a man learning to carry the weight of what he owes, not just financially, but in every way that word can mean. I don't know where we end up. I hope well. I hope that when Renee sits at my kitchen table and I serve something Susan used to make, A roast chicken maybe. Something warm and unpretentious. She sees the kind of man her husband came from. And I hope my son, for a moment, forgets to be impressive and just lets himself be a son again. I'm not angry anymore. I was never angry in the way people assume, the hot combusting kind. What I had was colder than that, and colder lasts longer, and it takes a particular kind of quiet to thaw it. He's thawing me. Slowly. I'll leave the door open. That's what fathers do. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. That's one thing nobody tells you about getting older. You have more time to sit with things. The noise slows down. The distractions thin out. And what's left is just you, and the choices you made, and what they actually say about you. I don't regret what I did. I want to be clear about that, not because I'm hardened, but because I've thought it through from every angle a 67-year-old man can manage, and I keep arriving at the same place. What I did wasn't revenge. Revenge is hot. Revenge wants the other person to hurt. What I did was something colder and more deliberate than that. I realigned. I looked at what I'd built, what I'd promised, and I asked myself honestly, does the shape of this still match who I am and what I value? And the answer was no. So I changed it. Caleb didn't lose my love when he posted that caption. He never had any risk of losing that. What he lost, temporarily, I hope, was my automatic trust. And those are not the same thing. You can love someone completely and still require them to earn back what they carelessly let go. That's not coldness, that's honesty. And honesty, I've come to believe, is the only real form of respect between two people. There's something I've noticed about cause and effect that has nothing to do with punishment or reward in any cosmic sense. It's simpler than that. The way you treat people teaches them how to treat you back. And more importantly, it teaches you what you're willing to accept. For years I accepted Caleb's drift because I told myself it was just a phase, just the busyness of a young man building his life. And in accepting it quietly, I taught him that it was acceptable. That's on me as much as it's on him. The promissory note sat uncollected for 2 years because I let it. The Sunday visits faded because I didn't say anything. I was so determined not to be a burden that I made myself invisible, and then I was surprised to find out he couldn't see me. That's what the Instagram photo did. It didn't create the problem, it just held up a mirror that was bright enough that I finally couldn't look away from it. What I want for Caleb, what I genuinely want, not as a father performing generosity, but as a man who has watched enough years pass to know how fast they go, is for him to become someone who doesn't need to be corrected this way again. Not because correction is painful, but because he'll have grown into a person for whom the correction is unnecessary. A person who thinks of the people who built him when life gets big. A person who understands that gratitude isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. You practice it the way you practice anything worth keeping. The $500 payment that arrived last Tuesday meant more to me than the money. It meant he's starting to understand that weight, that things have weight, that the people who love you deserve to be carried in your mind even when it's inconvenient, even when you're busy, even when your new life is pulling you forward and everything old feels like friction. I'm not finished being his father. Not close. I'll leave the door open for as long as I have doors to leave open. But I won't pretend anymore. That's the one thing I know for certain. Pretending costs too much. And at 67, I've stopped buying things I can't afford.